unknowns. What do they want? Are we about to come face to face with them, whether we're ready or not? Find out from the world's leading experts in this very special edition of Raiders Live News Talk Radio. You're listening to RNN Radio, where thinking people tune in.
This is the Raiders Live News Talk Radio Show. I'm your host, Tom Horn, and as always, joined here in the studio today by that Triple Crown winner who alone can explain the four ponies of the apocalypse. What? And who else but the guitar-assassinating wild man Joe Artis. We welcome you back to this special edition of Raiders Live News Talk Radio on this timely subject, official disclosure, prepare for contact. You've no doubt heard recently about the Royal Society, that National Academy of Scientists out of the UK, who as a part of its 350th anniversary celebrations recently brought together what they called, quote, some dizzying intellects, end quote, to ponder the emergent field of astrobiology and to ask this deep question, are we alone in the universe? Now, Vatican astronomers have been weighing in on the question, too. Their top scholars have been hinting that, in fact, we might not be alone. And a recent poll addressing how official disclosure could alter social ideas, including religious ideas, reveals that the public is also deeply considering this possibility that soon we might be faced with evidence of an extraterrestrial, or maybe better said, extra-dimensional intelligence. Well, to help us wrap our mind around this fascinating proposal that the Earth could soon be contacted by ultra-terrestrial unknowns, we have been interviewing all of this week some of the world's leading authorities, researchers, scientists, field investigators, government agents, and theologians on the ramifications of alien encounter. It is our privilege this morning to spend the next hour with pastor, biblical scholar, and co-host of Prophecy in the News, Gary Stearman. Now, Gary grew up in the world of aircraft design. In fact, beginning in 1925, the years before being sold to Boeing during the war, Stearman Aviation produced a variety of aircraft in which Gary's uncle, great-uncle, father, other family members were actually the designers, builders, and manufacturers of those famous planes. Now, while in engineering school himself, Gary felt called to write, and he added studies in linguistics, languages, including Greek, and Shakespearean research. So that's where that refined eloquence comes from that we'll be hearing here in just a moment. It was during that time that Gary honed his research skills that would later take him into the deepest studies of Scripture. For the last 27 years, Gary's been the pastor of the Bible church known as Grace Fellowship in Oklahoma City. Since 1987, he has worked in partnership with JR Church and Prophecy in the News, producing a monthly magazine, weekly television programs, and webcasts. But it is Gary's belief that we are now living in prophetically significant times, a time when the dark spirits of old are beginning to openly reveal themselves, masquerading sometimes as visitors from other worlds. In other words, this is the very man that we need to be talking about in this series of interviews, or talking to. Talking about? Well, maybe we'll do that here in a moment. So from behind his reinforced walls of his secret laboratory somewhere near Oklahoma City, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to this special edition of Raiders Live News Talk Radio, Gary Stearman. Good morning, Gary.
Good morning, Tom. How are you?
Pretty good.
Hey, after that introduction, I'm going to have to sit up a little straighter in my chair. But I'm ready to talk about the obsession that we have in the world today. Are we alone? Is anybody out there? Man seems obsessed with answering that question.
Well, that's right. Now, one quick question before I ask you about what's out there. What about what's down here in Oklahoma? Has it thawed out down there yet?
You know, we got a little snow, and it's supposed to melt, but then a little more is due to come in next Sunday, so it's strange. This global warming has really got a lot of snow falling.
Yeah, I think they found Al Gore frozen to a tree somewhere, didn't they?
I think so, yeah.
All right. Well, we got a lot of territory to cover, and I want to talk to you in particular about some of your research into this area of extraterrestrials, or more appropriately, as I said a moment ago, in my opinion, extra-dimensionals, but we'll hear what you have to say about that. And I want to get your response starting out to this avalanche of recent news concerning this idea, are we alone in the universe, coming out of the Royal Society. I must have 15 headlines sitting in front of me just from the last 7 or 8 days. News people everywhere just don't seem to want to let this question go. One of the headlines just from the last few days, the #1 astronomer for the Queen saying ET might be looking right at us and we don't even recognize them. Starting out, what can you tell us about these meetings and the material that seems to be all over the news right now about this?
Well, you know, everybody knows the term X-Files, and the UK has, in the Public Records Office, has hoarded these X-Files for literally decades. The United States has done the same thing, and there's almost been a religious silence. When you talk about a religious silence, I'm thinking of the Vatican, for example, which has on its index many secrets from ages past and really invented the idea of above top secret. And in their files, the Vatican has dealt with strange lore from down through the ages, put that all on file, and so it's not a surprise to me that the Vatican, European governments, perhaps even the United States, have arrived at the point where they believe now it's time to ask the big question. What's going on in our atmosphere? Because they're literally an ages-long record of visitors from perhaps another dimension, but now the popular belief is from the stars, visitors from other galaxies, perhaps other planets, who have come to Earth on a mission. And the Vatican has begun to ask the question, what mission exactly are they on? How should we relate to these visitors, and should we regard them seriously? Do they have something they can teach us? Should we teach them something? In other words, the Vatican, as well as some of the governments around the world, the Vatican seems to be preparing for a meeting of some sort, and I frankly believe that meeting is going to happen.
Now, you talk about the X-Files out of Britain. We interviewed Nick Pope a couple of nights ago, former lead investigator for the British Mod, on those X-Files, and for the first time we got Nick to admit this might be supernatural as opposed to a physical manifestation. But let's get specifically to your research. And in fact, in this month's edition of Prophecy in the News magazine on this question of the Vatican, there's a feature article by you. It has a picture of the Pope standing next to an alien. And part of the caption says that while the Pope probably didn't actually meet with this nasty-looking creature, the Vatican does seem to be preparing their adherents to welcome Earth's space brothers. Let's talk about that, beginning with the question, what are the spiritual issues that are raised by space aliens?
Well, we have an Associated Press article headlined, E.T. Phone Rome, which is a little humorous touch, but the article talks about the questions of life's origin, whether life exists elsewhere in the universe, and the Reverend Jose Gabriel Funes, who is director of the Vatican Observatory, presented last November in a 5-day conference. He presented arguments in favor of the presence of ETs, and basically was campaigning for a meeting between humans and extraterrestrials. And I'm going to just read a quote here. Funes said the possibility of alien life raises many philosophical and theological implications, but he added that the gathering was mainly focused on the scientific perspective and how different disciplines can be used to explore the issue. So here we have a marriage, if you will, of what has classically been called religion and science. And it's fascinating that we live in a time when the popular science and the popular religious ideas are coming together. Now, ETs. What do you think of when you think of ETs? Well, you might think of a lizard. You might think of a little gray alien with the big black eyes. You might think of some kind of a praying mantis-looking creature. You might think of a very tall, beautiful, blonde-headed Nordic type. All of these are rich in UFO lore from ancient history. But let's get the Vatican in here, because we have Gabriel Funes' own probing question in the matter. Did the aliens experience their own version of original sin, and if not, what kind of creatures are they? Imagine that. The Vatican, of course, is built around the idea of original sin and the need for redemption, which is the central Christian idea. What if aliens came here who never experienced original sin? That's the question that's being asked. Should we regard them as perhaps mentors, come here to help us out of our human condition? So I think, Tom, that's the question that the Vatican is concerned with. Really, they're concerned with the idea of sin on planet Earth. They're almost looking to the aliens to be able to answer some questions for them.
And you know what's interesting about this, when you're talking about Father Gabriel Funes, and I kind of remember parts of that, where he was actually indicating that if they came here without original sin, then therefore they would be morally, spiritually superior to us. So your word mentor takes on an entirely different kind of meaning. I also noticed that it isn't just for those people listening to this show that are not familiar with what the Vatican's been doing in the last 24 months. Funes was just the latest. You've got Corrado Balducci out there, who a few years ago said that the aliens are already here, in contact with the Earth, and that the Vatican is aware of it. Nick Pope said he knows Corrado Balducci personally and believes that he is very, very sincere about that, being honest at least in his own understanding. Guy Cosmonologo, a couple years ago, wrote his Alien Life or Intelligent Life in the Universe. Yeah, I mean, this really, we could probably do a whole show just on this one question. What in the world is the Vatican really insinuating here about these things being morally superior to us, outside of the sin question?
Well, it's fascinating. Redemption, we believe, it really is the central issue of the Christian faith. Redemption came through Christ. Now, the Bible depicts Christ's incarnation as a unique event, once for all time, and that is so emphatic in Scripture, I don't even think I need to repeat it. Christ's incarnation didn't happen anywhere else, and I think if it had, we'd probably be told about it. But the cross of Christ, and here I'm going to get into a term that some people may say, well, what's this doing in relation to ETs? Well, the cross of Christ redeemed the broken universe. So says Scripture. And the fact that it went beyond this earth, that is, the finished work of Christ, was universal in nature. That being the case, if it was a solitary event in time, never to be repeated, then Gabriel Funes has a problem. His assumption goes out into among all the galaxies and says, well, Christ's redemption didn't reach that far, or did it? We've got that question. How do you react to that fundamental question?
Excuse me. I wanted to ask, does the Bible even support the idea of ETs from other worlds?
Actually, it supports the idea of ETs. And, of course, that's the term extraterrestrial, meaning outside this planet. But some have suggested that that's not a very good term. Maybe UT would be a better term, ultra-terrestrials. And that's been used in the past. Ultra meaning from beyond, which would take in travel between dimensions. Now, and there we get into a biblical idea. Earth being one dimension, and then a dimension just beyond human sight being another dimension. And so if we call these visitors ultra-terrestrial, suddenly we're in the pages of Scripture, because the Bible is absolutely full of events about creatures, events involving creatures who suddenly appear, and they're among us, and then they disappear. In fact, all of secular literature, you go back in history, the Romans, the Greeks, they all talk about these strange visitors.
You know, one of the questions that several of the people that we've talked to this week, especially the ones that have their scholarship in biblical studies, have raised this question about whether angels would actually need or use celestial transportation vehicles, what people are commonly calling UFOs, I suppose. What is your take on that?
Well, my take on it is that indeed they do. They are commonly referred to in the Old Testament as chariots. I remember the Old Testament story of Elisha and his servant, who were surrounded by the enemy, and Elisha opened the servant's eyes to the fact that, hey, there are the chariots of God all around us. Now, chariot, you know, in the Hebrew, Merkava, the chariot is a flying vehicle, sometimes visible to human eyes, sometimes not. And it perfectly fits the idea of what we have come to call a UFO. And I believe, quite frankly, Tom, that UFOs are in two categories. There are the good ones and the evil ones. And it's not hard to tell the difference, quite frankly. I think that we are beset by UFOnauts who are probably evil in intention. And we have book after book after book written on some of the dark things they've done to people. On the other hand, occasionally there are appearances that seem more in the angelic realm. But whatever realm you're talking about, those celestial transportation vehicles are called in the Old Testament Merkavim, chariots. And even the Lord, by the way, even the Lord rides upon a chariot, which I think is amazing. For example, in Ezekiel chapter 1, and I'm sure you've spoken with others about this many times, the Lord appears to Ezekiel in what can only be described as one of these Merkavim, chariots.
Also, have you ever looked at this, like in 1 Chronicles 28:18? It actually refers to building a model, if you will, and it says, after the pattern of the chariot of the cherubims that spread out their wings.
Yeah, the pattern of the chariot of the cherubims. And that pattern, by the way, seems to be a wheel-shaped pattern. For example, if you go to Daniel, and you look at Daniel's vision of the Lord sitting on his throne, Daniel 7:10 says, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set. The books were open. Well, that's the setting. But that fire has a form. His throne was like a fiery flame, Daniel 7:9, and his wheels as burning fire. And we read in Scripture that those wheels go back and forth from his throne. Those seem to be the chariots of the cherubim. That is, the chariots are wheel-shaped. And perfectly, by the way, corresponding to what Ezekiel saw, as he stood by the river Kibar in Babylon, a fiery wheel came across the plain and stopped and landed before him. So, as strange as it sounds, the Bible supports the idea of celestial transportation vehicles for both angels and dark forces.
Now, so here's a hypothetical question then. If the stolen artifacts of the temple were ever found and there was a golden UFO model in there, what would the response among theologians be?
Well, you know, that brings up the whole question of the ark. Talk about the temple, the ark has the two cherubim atop it with their wings touching, and those cherubs are guardians over the ark, and they are kind of models of what goes on at the throne of God in heaven. The cherubs seem to be God's representatives presiding over various various life forms on this planet. So God is represented by these creatures. Now, all of this, and I'd like to come back to this question about extraterrestrials. When the Vatican had that meeting, they invited atheists, they invited Catholic leaders, they invited scientists and different groups. In fact, they invited people from SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. They invited astronomers. And they broke up that meeting into segments where they talked about the origins of life, they talked about the environment, the human genome, where did the human genome come from, including, by the way, Tom, the question of did extraterrestrials seed this planet? Mm-hmm. Are they our true parents? And so the Vatican really got right back to origins in this conference, and I find that truly amazing. In other words, it's amazing in the sense that we have now come to a point in human history where the creation questions are right out there on the table for everybody to see.
Mm-hmm. Well, Guy Cosmonalgo, who wrote his Intelligent Life in the Universe that came out a couple of years ago, has already said publicly that his next project, what he called a mind-bending mental experiment, is under the working title, The Jesus Seed, which sounds suspicious to me like some kind of directed panspermia.
Exactly. Panspermia being the doctrine that there was an original intelligent life species somewhere in the universe who sent their DNA out in who knows what little rocket ships all over the universe, which would fall on various planets and sprout into other life forms. It's a kind of a wishful thinking to me, but that's what they believe nevertheless.
Mm-hmm. Let's get back to these cherubim. From what you were saying, I'm taking it that the cherubim might be higher than the angels, and there's also a question about who was the fifth watcher. You want to talk about that?
Well, yeah. A minute ago, I made a statement that around the throne of God there are the watchers, and these watchers seem to represent the kingdom of the birds, the kingdom of the domestic animals, the wild animals, and the kingdom of man. In other words, the four divisions of creation. But the Bible also says that once there was another watcher, and he was called the anointed cherub that covereth, which I think is quite fascinating. The anointed cherub that covereth, and the Hebrew wording there places him as the highest of God's representatives at the throne. And guess what? The anointed cherub that covereth is simply a euphemism. It's a euphemism for a creature of great intelligence who watches over a specific area of life in the universe. In this case, on planet Earth, we discover from other scripture that the anointed cherub fomented rebellion in the heavens, later became known as Satan, but he's also known as the serpent. And we find out, and it's not difficult to find out at all, that he's reptilian in nature. That is, he is, without a question, a reptile, and he must have been a watcher over the reptilian kingdom. In other words, there used to be 5 watchers at the throne of God, and the chief among them was a reptile. And it's safe to assume that, like the other watchers, he watched over a kingdom, specifically the kingdom of the reptiles, which, as we know from archaeology, was once the dominant kingdom on this planet. Suddenly it died out and became represented by a bunch of squiggly, creepy little creatures, and their leader must have been vanquished. And once they were great, now they have fallen. And that's sort of the beginning of this long story about the watchers. The anointed cherub that covereth is now the abhorrent serpent who is running his own program. And we read in the book about what's going to happen to his program.
That's one of the most fascinating things I have ever heard. I'm going to have to follow up on that personally. Absolutely thank you for that. I'm looking at your article here. I'm actually holding the February edition of the Prophecy in the News magazine in my hands. Your lead article, the feature article, The Extraterrestrial Question. And you write, religious authorities must ask whether these assumed aliens from space evolved from some primordial ooze or were created in the same fashion as Adam. Also, various reports state that these spacemen often appear in radically different forms. Could it be said of them that, like man, they were created in God's own image? Most likely not. A lizard, gray alien with bulging black eyes, insectoid or other bizarre creatures does not bear God's image. But then you say parenthetically, curiously, however, they do resemble historical descriptions of demons.
Yes, they do. As a matter of fact, we don't have to look far to see historical descriptions of demons. All we have to do is go to any historical library. There are dozens of them in Europe, here in America, where they have artifacts from ancient Babylon, the area of the ancient Assyrians, Nineveh, ancient Rome. They have dug up little statues of the creatures that were worshipped back in those days. We know them to be representations of demons. And guess what? They look just like the modern manifestations of little UFOnauts. I'm thinking particularly those big-eyed grays. You can go to the libraries and go to the museums of Europe and see dozens of little teraphim, little statues that were worshipped by the ancients, and they have an amazing resemblance to today's UFOnauts.
Now, let's talk for a moment about the ranks of angels.
Yeah, well, we mentioned the cherubs, and Kiruv in the Hebrew, which translates cherub in English, is the designation of that is a kind of loving care. That is to say, if you can imagine a mother watching over a child, that idea is expressed there. Then you get into the angels themselves, which seem to be the archons, and below those, in the New Testament, we have the exousion, or exousia, the delegated authorities. Below those, we have the rulers of darkness, or night rulers, and then we have demons. So really, there seem to be the cherubs, and then below that, 4 classes of angels. Archons, would call them archangels. Exousia, the delegated authorities, which we'd call ordinary angels. Below those would be the powers of the darkness. And I'm talking now about angels as we experience them today. Paul speaks of the 4 classes as being the powers delegated under Satan. So there are 4 levels of power, and we can assume that in their origins, angels were also delegated in much the same way. It's fascinating that people who perceive UFOnauts in one way or another, whether they're abductees or experiencers, seem to rank the pilots of these UFOs in similar fashions. There are often reports given of dominant figures, very handsome appearing creatures, mid-range creatures who have a less handsome appearance, the little grays who seem to be servants. Some people have called them robots, and then many people have had nightmarish experiences in regard to UFOs. So there seem to be ranks among these UFOnauts that roughly correspond to what the Bible calls principalities and powers.
Now, some people see a connection between these angels as well as the demons in this study of UFOs, but also historically in the study of the Nephilim and the flood of Noah. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. As a matter of fact, and you've written a lot about this yourself, the Nephilim, and to me, and we have a great deal of historical precedence for the fact that angels walked among men. The Greeks, the Romans spoke of exactly what the Bible speaks of in Genesis chapter 6 when it says that these fallen angels walked among men, took wives from among the daughters of men, and set up their own kingdoms. They seem to have done this, and here I'd like to talk with you and get your opinion, but in my opinion, they seem to have done this to establish a race, basically a race fashioned after their own genetic patterns, a super race, if you will, over which they could rule. That seems to have been their program. The Book of Enoch seems to support that. The Bible supports it. And you know, it's fascinating. Even philosophers like Plato support that. And a lot of people don't know about this. But here's a biblical theme that you can find right in the pages of Plato's dialogues. In the Critias, for example, he says the god Poseidon came down to earth, and he took an earthly wife. And by the way, the family of this girl is mentioned by Plato, the mother and the father. Their only daughter was named Clito, and Poseidon, the god, took her as a wife, and he sired 5 pairs of twins, and he raised them to manhood. And one of the children of that union was named Atlas. And he built an island called Atlantis, which was later destroyed in the flood. Now, that's from the philosopher Plato, and it sounds remarkably like what we find in the Bible. Wouldn't you agree?
I absolutely would, and I'll take it even a step further. Human DNA corruption in the days of Noah, this story is certainly very suspiciously similar to the story you just told, to the legend behind the Titans, that the gods came down and intermingled with humans, out of which came forth these demigods. It's interesting that you mentioned Poseidon. There's a movie, and I can't even think of the name of it right now. It's made for teenagers, but it's in the theaters right now, and the idea is this boy discovers that he is a demigod, that he is the long offspring of the god Poseidon. Wow. And there was a news report last week in which one of the guys who was reviewing this film said, no, it's not Clash of the Titans. Nita was holding up a card to me. No, it's another one right now. It's like a boy's name, and anyway, he learns that he is the offspring of Poseidon. But the film reviewer pointed out how that during the dialogue in this movie, and people are learning that among us right now are numerous people who don't realize that they are the offspring of these mythical gods, but that they are walking around us right now. And if they could discover this reality about themselves and get in touch with that energy, they would be able to do supernatural-like type things, have extra human ability. And in the dialogue in this, it says that there are even people such as U.S. presidents. Mm-hmm. And the critic for this film says that there was a subtle message in this new movie that's out right now that Obama might be a demigod based on the dialogue that's in this film. But in any case, let me get back to the UFOs, because do you believe that echoed today in what happened with the Watchers and this DNA corruption, that we are seeing something similar in these UFO flap areas and abduction areas where people are abducted, ovum is removed, scoop marks, animals are found with parts of their DNA removed in laser-like fashion? I mean, is this kind of a modern mirror to what was going on in the days of old? And if so, what are they doing? Why are they collecting human DNA?
I absolutely believe that, and I believe they have a program which is at least 60 years old. We can track it back to about 1947, which brings up another topic, by the way. But let me just interject from my personal perspective that I came out of a family who were in the aircraft business and who were in the business of designing various kinds of devices. I'll just put it that way, for the government. And many of my relatives were and still are classified above top secret. And the table conversation that I heard going back into youth was that there were significant UFO events that had been covered up by the government, but more than that, the government was actually in the business of collecting technology from aliens, which was then being integrated into our own design technology. I heard this as a child, essentially, and so that has kind of colored what I believe. And as I've listened over the years to what other people are saying, I have come to the conclusion that this is the same sort of bargain that took place in the days before the flood, in which the fallen angels came down to man and said, we have this superior technology that we will offer you in exchange for what? For your blood, your DNA, and your souls, so that we may rule over you. And I think the transaction that is going on between governments of the world and the ultra-terrestrials is exactly the same as it was in the days before the flood. So that would be my quick answer.
Well, so we're talking about a modern Faustian agreement that is much higher than most people could even imagine, and what you said is absolutely the truth, that it was an exchange of technology and even knowledge, mystical arts. Is for the use, which raises an interesting question we won't take time to exercise. The fact that they had to get permission from people says something about the rights that we have under God that can be surrendered but don't have to be, in which we allow these things to use us, manipulate us, take control of us. Here's an even more fantastic proposal. Enoch says that these Nephilim, when they were destroyed in the flood, they were buried in the hills of the earth. Now, I don't know, if the angels took them, buried them there, they were swept in there by the waters of the flood, and they've been buried beneath these sands. Could these things ever be discovered? Maybe have part of them been discovered? Is something happening with their DNA?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think that the bones of those people, those ancient aberrations, have been found on numerous occasions, and they are quickly hidden away, kept out of the gaze of human beings, because such a thing would run counter to what we believe about, for example, modern science wants to believe evolution, that man sort of arose from the ooze. If you could prove that there were super beings in generations past, that would totally smash the idea of the evolutionary theory. So secular science is against this idea because it runs counter to the idea, to their own conception of evolution. Christians are against the idea in a lot of cases because they don't understand God's program and they don't understand the work of Satan. But in my opinion, a Christian needs to be armed with all this information so that we'll more fully understand prophecy, more fully understand God's plan for the latter days. And on the subject, by the way, of these intruders, back in the old days, they were called Rephaim. They were called, that is their offspring, the offspring of the demigods and the human women were called in the Bible Rephaim. And Rephaim comes from the Hebrew Rapha, which has a strange complex of meanings. It means, it's regularly translated giant, but it also means to heal, to mend, to repair, or to fix something that was broken. And the Bible has an interesting prophecy in Genesis 6. It says there were giants in the earth in those days and also after that, which is generally thought to mean there were giants before the flood, there were giants after the flood. Where did these giants come from? They came from the interaction between fallen angels and human beings. The Bible refers to them as Rephaim, and Rephaim is three things. In the Old Testament, it's a place name, the Valley of the Rephaim. It is a designation, that is to say, it's roughly the designation for a giant in general, and it's often translated giant in the Old Testament. But it also has a genetic component. Mm-hmm. The Rephaim are those who are so corrupted in their genome that they cannot experience redemption or resurrection. And to me, that's a fascinating subject.
Well, talking about genome and resurrection, science now is perfecting cloning technology. They just sequenced the genome of the Neanderthal, according to some of the news out this week. One of the university professors that was being interviewed for those news stories, and this was reported by several reputable news sources, says whether it is ethical or not, it is going to happen. They are going to resurrect extinct Neanderthal. The Nephilim seem to have had some method for returning too, because as you just pointed out, they were before the flood, but they also were after the flood. Do you think there's any connection between high technology and what we may now be proposing?
I absolutely do. And I alluded to that a moment ago with the idea. And, of course, there have been dozens of books written on the subject. Colonel Frank Corso's book is probably the best known, the Faustian bargain, as you called it, in which we trade information for technology, has resulted in a corruption of the human genome. I have heard expressed on several occasions the idea that government officials the world over now see as one of our chief problems discerning between a true human being, genetically pure human being, and a hybrid human being. And the idea is that these aliens who have intruded and given us all this wonderful technology have also hybridized themselves so that they can walk among us unknown. Now this is
Gary, if the Watchers were engaging in genetic manipulation before the flood, why couldn't they be doing the same thing today? And here's a wild question, does this suggest anything about things like Bigfoot or Loch Ness?
Absolutely. I think that, for example, Bigfoot, which is seen everywhere, and Bigfoot and Loch Ness share a common feature. They are very real. Anyone who's ever seen either one of them is just absolutely imprinted for life, shocked. And we read case study after case study. But Nessie and Bigfoot also share another significant feature, and that is they can appear as solid as a rock 1 second, and the next second they vanish into nothingness, and they're just gone. And they seem to be in this realm of the ultra-terrestrial. I call Nessie a dragon because there's much dragon lore from the Middle Ages. We have so much lore about dragons that used to be pests among the Europeans of the Middle Ages. We read, about dragon slayers. We read about dragons historically. And I think that the dragon, which, by the way, according to description, kind of scuttles along on its stomach, is a grounded version of the ancient dragon that used to soar among men in glory, and of course, that dragon was Satan. There's so much we can say about him. The dragon has a people. These people are the Rephaim. It's kind of fascinating concerning the great dragon, that serpent, Satan. Isaiah 14 has a prophecy about his ultimate destruction. And the 9th verse of Isaiah 14 says, "Hell from beneath is moved up for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth." Now, the dead here, translated dead in the King James, are the Rephaim, and they are the dead hybrids, if you will. And the fascinating thing that I want to insert quickly here is that Isaiah also says that the dead can never experience resurrection. Isaiah 26:14 says they are dead. That's a translation of the term Rephaim. They are the Rephaim. They shall not live. They are deceased. They shall not rise. Therefore hast thou visited and destroyed them and made all their memory to perish. So Isaiah prophesies concerning these hybrids called the Rephaim that once they die or once they pass from this scene and go to the underworld, they can never after that be resurrected. And that takes us all the way back to the pre-flood days. The Lord destroyed the world in the flood, and he gives the reason. Noah and his family were perfect in their generations. That is, their genome had not been corrupted, so they were preserved and brought into the new world the people of the old world whose genome had been corrupted were all destroyed. And the bottom line is, Tom, if humanity, if the human genome is corrupt, then God's plan for the redemption of man can be short-circuited. And that's the fight that's going on.
Now, what about other lake monsters like Champ, Ogopogo, and didn't Job see a vision of the dragon in the sea?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Job did indeed see a vision of the dragon in the sea. The dragon called Leviathan, and he's so beautifully described. The lake monsters of the world, there are several. In County Galway in Ireland, there's a lake where people see their local dragon all the time. In Lake Champlain, on the border between New York and Vermont, there's a huge sea monster, or lake monster, called Champ, and hundreds of people have seen him. He comes up out of the water. He is viewed, and then he disappears. They launch investigations. Nobody ever sees anything. There's in Cornwall, in England, there is a lake monster that is regularly seen. And cryptozoologists, with their little microscopes and binoculars and cameras have chased these monsters and never been able to catch one, because I think that they are just beyond this dimension, occasionally able to be witnessed. There's a fascinating thing. In fact, there was a book written by a gentleman, F.W. Holliday wrote a book once, and I can't remember when it was published, but the name of the book was The Dragon and the Disc. And Holliday, who was an English gentleman, referenced all of the instances in which dragons were seen to interact with flying discs. And he catalogs literally hundreds of such sightings down through history. And there's one that we all know about, and the next time you go into a Chinese restaurant, I want you to look at the dragons that are hanging around on the light fixtures and so forth and so on, and you will always notice that just in front of the dragon's mouth is a little fiery disc. And I once asked someone from China, what is that disc in front of that dragon's mouth? And I was told that, according to our religion, is the knowledge and intellect and wisdom that the dragon once possessed, but it was taken from him, and he has forever been chasing it since. So you always have the dragon with the fiery disc just in front of his mouth. He's seeking to reunite himself and to regain his power, his lost power. And I think, isn't that fascinating? Because, in our Western lore, we have things like dragons, things like Bigfoot. And Bigfoot, too, is often seen in the company of flying discs. As you know, you've probably read all the accounts yourself.
Right. Well, and on this question that except for rare appearances where they turn up, people chase them, try to capture them, then they're gone. It's like they're moving in and out of a higher dimension.
Yes.
But they continue to remain just beyond the reach of our vision to be able to capture and study one. But I'm looking back into your article again, the February edition of Prophecy in the News, the lead story by Gary Stearman, The Extraterrestrial Question. And on page 10, you say, today, however, under conditions in which the influence of God's Holy Spirit is diminishing, there is a quickening of their appearances, giving credence to a false scenario. First of all, I want to tell you, when I first read that the other day, it put a chill down my spine. Just the way you wrote that, under influences in which God's Holy Spirit is diminishing. What a frightening thought that is. But as it is, more and more of these manifestations over the past couple of decades are looming, giving credence to a false scenario. What was you talking about?
The false scenario is seen in so many different ways. One of the things I mentioned was movies. I will never forget, when I was 14 years old, a movie came out. It's called The Day the Earth Stood Still. Flying saucer lands in Washington, D.C., and this very handsome space traveler with his absolutely phenomenal robot called Gort steps out, and and he comes forth with a proposal. In fact, he comes forth with an ultimatum. He addresses an assembly of the world's leaders, and he announces that unless they find peace and give up the nuclear arms race, Earth will be reduced to a burned-out cinder. And yet he it sets a kind of a trend in what I call hits from outer space. You have E.T. the Extraterrestrial, you have Flash Gordon, you have Star Trek and Star Wars, and you have the old grade B movies from the 50s, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, and they all carry a theme that humanity is corrupt and evil. Unless it mends its wayward ways, the extraterrestrials are going to have to step in and set things straight. And the extraterrestrials, of course, are the dark side. From our perspective, from their perspective, they are the saviors of the earth. We think of Close Encounters of the Earth, of the first kind, or of the third kind, and we have the mothership, and we have, appearing as great peacemakers from beyond here to oversee and to revamp the evil ways of mankind. So we're right in the middle of a giant propaganda war. And that's part of what I meant by under the conditions in which the influence of God's Holy Spirit is diminishing, there is the rise of this incredible flood of propaganda. I read the other day that there are now 32 movies in production in Hollywood on the theme of extraterrestrial saviors from outer space. And of course, we just came through Avatar. Avatar, in which we have giant, beautiful creatures on another planet who are superior to humans in virtually every way. And the humans are pictured as savages. The extraterrestrials are pictured as spiritual superiors. But in fact, anyone with a half a gram of knowledge about the Bible would instantly recognize them as pagans. So we're in the middle of a propaganda war.
Well, I'll jump back just for a second. I always wanted my own Gort to deal with those nasty school bullies.
Yes, indeed. Oh, yeah, it'd be nice to have a Gort at your side.
Just every once in a while. I mean, you don't really want to destroy the world, but once in a while you need a Gort. Hey, we've got about 7 minutes left. Where is this going, Gary? What's on the immediate horizon that you think people should be aware of?
What I think people should be aware of is a kind of a Mephistophelian bargain between today's intellectuals and our alien visitors, who are now being courted both by science and religion. The Vatican Conference, there was an MIT conference on Close Encounters of the Fourth Kind back in, I believe, 1992. It's amazing how many scientific and religious figures are now banding together and courting, if you will, those whom they believe to be our saviors, namely visitors from outer space. And this perfectly fits into the secular model. In the article, you may have noticed that I went into a little history about Dr. Francis Crick, discoverer of human DNA. And Crick, after years and years of experimentation, adopted the idea of panspermia. That's a 1908 idea that says that man was created when intelligent life elsewhere seeded the universe, and the seeds sprouted on various planets. Well, Crick said the probability of a human protein randomly forming in the proper sequence is about 1 chance in 10 to the 260th. And when you consider that the total number of elementary particles in the universe is only about 10 to the 80th, Crick says, well, one can see that the probabilities of spontaneous generation of life are virtually non-existent, impossible. And so at the end of his life, Crick adopted this idea that intelligent extraterrestrials seeded human life. Now, Crick is one of our most exalted Nobel Prize winners, Tom, and he is the model for modern science, which is now leaning in that direction. And if an ultra-terrestrial stepped forth and offered them his hand, I'm sure they would accept it.
I've only got time probably for one more question, and it will be equally cerebrally challenging for a guy like me, but not for you. And it moves from astrobiology to a related field, astroarchaeology. You know that a few years ago, especially, this whole Cydonia region of Mars was really hot. What appeared to be, unnatural structures. At the time, I remember interviewing Dr. Thomas Van Flandern, who had done a lot of study for this, and he has his PhD in astronomy and emphasis in celestial mechanics from Yale University. And he told me at the time that he and some other scientists had concluded that the combined odds against what was in Cydonia, the face, the five-sided pyramid, what they call the city complex, that the chance of that arising by chance were 1,000 billion to 1. Here's the quick last question. Whether it's Mars or some other place, do you think that there will ever be a discovery of extraterrestrial archaeological evidence, and or if there ever was, would this be physical remains of this earlier reference you made to this prehistoric war, maybe when Lucifer was cast down, or would it be something else?
Wow, how I wish we had another hour. You've just opened up a brand new one, because, yes, in fact, I do believe that the Earth is scattered with artifacts from a previous era. In fact, whole books have been written on the subject of forbidden archaeology, as you know. And books have been devoted to the idea that there are artifacts in the solar system from ancient superior cultures. There was a fall, and there was a magnificent fall from grace in the hierarchy around God's throne. And the whole Bible is concerned with the idea of the fall and redemption. And Tom, I believe that fall is far more complicated and far more widespread than most Christians generally believe. Usually, we reduce it down to a couple in the garden and a forbidden fruit and a little serpent there who kind of stepped up with some advice for Eve. But I think it's much, much, much bigger than that. I think it's universal in proportion. I think our solar system shows signs of being savagely torn at one point in history. There are a number of books. Velikovsky wrote about this. Others have. Planets seem to have exploded. Mars seems to have been stripped of its atmosphere. It has a canyon on one side of it as long as the United States is wide. Something horrible happened at one point that destroyed, I think, a superior civilization. And that war, I think, was of heavenly proportions. And I think that it all focuses back on the coming of our Lord, who came specifically to heal the broken creation. That's why he came.
Gary, how can people learn more about you before we run out of time?
Well, prophecyinthenews.com is a good way to find out. We have regular webcasts daily. We have podcasts so you can download to iTunes or your iPod, and you can watch our 30-minute broadcasts right on the web, prophecyinthenews.com.
All right. Well, we've been talking with biblical scholar, one of my favorite men and writers, Gary Stearman of Prophecy in the News. He's also the pastor there of Bible Church in Oklahoma City. If you live in that area and you're looking for a good church and you don't mind being challenged to think, I would imagine that he'd probably accept you in there with open arms. This is the Raiders Live News Talk Radio Special Edition. Gary, thank you so much for being on the air with us today.
Tom, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Raiders Live News Talk Radio. We'll continue in a moment. Don't go away.